In the silent hospital hallway, two little girls wept. Only a millionaire CEO stopped to notice. The hospital lights flickered faintly, casting pale shadows across the white walls, while the sterile smell of disinfectant clung to the air like an unshakable weight. The echo of hurried footsteps from distant nurses broke the stillness every few seconds, yet the long corridor where the children sat felt frozen in time. On a narrow wooden bench pressed against the wall, Emma, only 8 years old, held her little sister Lily, 6, in a protective embrace, both girls shivering in their thin clothes. Emma's eyes were red and swollen from crying, but she kept biting her lip, determined not to let the tears spill again, because she believed she had to stay strong for Lily. The younger girl's face was buried in her sister's shoulder, damp from endless sobbing, her tiny body trembling each time a distant machine beeped. The double doors of the operating theatre loomed at the end of the hall, their cold metal surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. Every time they swung open, Emma's heart leapt with desperate hope. But it was always just a nurse rushing past, or a doctor carrying files, never the words she longed to hear. Their mother had been taken inside hours ago after a sudden accident, and the only words left with them were the doctor's hurried whisper, "Pray for her." Since then, no family had arrived, no comforting arms wrapped around them, no gentle voices assured them it would be okay. The world outside seemed to have forgotten them, leaving only the hum of machines and the ticking of the clock above the nurse's station as cruel reminders of time slipping away. Emma clenched her fists, whispering quiet prayers she barely remembered, while Lily tugged at her sleeve and asked with a trembling voice, "Is Mummy going to come back?" Emma hesitated, her throat tight with fear, but forced herself to nod and answer, "Yes, she has to." Words she hoped were true, but mostly said to soothe her sister. A cold draft slipped through the hallway whenever the main door opened, making Lily shiver, and Emma pulled her closer, though she herself was freezing. Their shoes barely shielded them from the chill of the tiles, their legs dangling off the bench because they were too small to touch the floor. Emma's mind replayed the sound of screeching tires, the crash, and the moments before their mother was taken away, her voice weak but steady as she told them to be brave. That memory pressed against Emma's chest like a weight too heavy for a child to carry. Nurses and staff moved past them without pausing, glancing briefly but never stopping, as though the girls were invisible. Emma wanted to scream, to demand someone notice, but the lump in her throat silenced her. Instead, she rubbed Lily's arm in slow circles, trying to comfort her. Lily sniffled, lifting her tear-streaked face to look down the corridor, her eyes filled with desperate hope each time footsteps echoed closer. But again and again, it was no one they knew. No comforting news, just strangers passing. Emma leaned back against the wall, her head tilted toward the ceiling as she imagined her mother's warm smile, the way she tucked them into bed, the sound of her laughter while cooking. The memories made the silence sharper, like a knife cutting into her chest. "Close your eyes, Lily," Emma whispered, but Lily shook her head quickly, whispering, "If I sleep, something bad will happen." Emma wanted to argue, but she couldn't, because deep down, she felt the same fear. The intercom above crackled with names and codes neither of them understood, the harsh voices breaking into the heavy quiet. The bench creaked softly as Emma shifted, brushing Lily's hair back and tucking it behind her ear the way their mother always did. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and lifeless, as though they were the only souls trapped inside it. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights above, the squeak of a janitor's mop, the faint shuffle of papers. These became the soundtrack to their waiting. Emma's hands were small but steady as she held Lily tightly, her whispered promise, "We just have to hold on," slipping through trembling lips. Lily clung tighter, afraid to let go, her tiny fingers gripping Emma's sleeve until her knuckles turned white. Hours felt like days, and each second dragged heavier than the last. The girls sat in silence again, swallowed by the enormity of the hospital's cold indifference. The doors at the end of the hall opened once more, and both girls froze in breathless anticipation. But it was only another nurse rushing past, not the news they prayed for. Emma's heart sank deeper, but she stayed still, holding her sister as if that single act of love was the only shield they had left. The hallway remained dim and silent, except for the constant hum of machines, and in that quiet, the two little girls clung to each other, fragile, frightened, and unseen by the world around them. Daniel Carter, at 42, was a man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and headlines, a CEO known for building a ruthless empire where failure was never tolerated and compassion was often dismissed as weakness. And tonight, his polished shoes echoed sharply against the marble floor as he moved through the hospital with his usual brisk pace, his mind occupied with the declining health of a business partner whose influence he could not afford to lose. The corridor lights reflected off his tailored black suit, his posture straight, his expression carved into the cold mask he wore in every deal, a man too used to control, too used to having the world bend to his will. Yet, as he turned the corner and stepped into the long, dim hallway, the faintest sound slipped into his awareness. A fragile, broken sobbing, soft but piercing enough to stop him mid-step, an unfamiliar interruption to his carefully ordered thoughts. His brow furrowed as he slowed, each step now measured, his instincts caught between ignoring it and turning toward the source. Daniel was not a man easily distracted, but this sound carried something raw, something that reached beneath the armor he had built over decades of survival and success. His eyes scanned the corridor with their usual sharpness, the same gaze that could dismantle a contract in seconds or intimidate an entire room. But what they found was not a competitor or a problem to solve. It was two little girls huddled together on a bench, their small frames curled inward as if trying to vanish into the cold wall behind them. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, a rare stillness settling over him, as if time itself had paused, and in that silence, the distant hum of machines faded behind the sound of the children's muffled sobs. His chest tightened unexpectedly, an echo of something long buried rising in his memory, something he had worked tirelessly to forget. He had been their age once, small and helpless, sitting in a hospital not unlike this one, waiting for news that never came, abandoned in a way only a child could understand. The sight before him cracked something inside the fortress of his heart, a crack so sudden it startled him. His hand slipped into his pocket out of habit, fingers brushing against the edge of his phone, tempted to distract himself with a business message, to look away and keep walking as if he hadn't seen them, as if they were just part of the background like everything else in his world. But his feet betrayed him. Instead of carrying him forward, they slowed until he came to a complete stop in the middle of the hallway. His eyes, sharp and calculating in every negotiation, softened without his permission as they lingered on the GI. Arle's tear-streaked faces. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about mergers, profits, or strategies. He was thinking about the raw fragility of two children who had no one else. A strange weight pressed against his chest. Not the familiar stress of deadlines, but something unfamiliar, something human. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry, his carefully controlled breathing uneven. The air around him felt different, heavy with the kind of truth no deal could erase. Daniel Carter, the man known for never hesitating, found himself standing still, unable to simply walk away. His mind whispered all the reasons to ignore them, to move on, to stay detached, but his heart, long silenced, whispered louder, urging him to stay. He shifted his gaze to the sterile walls, then back to the sisters, their small hands clutching one another, their eyes red from endless tears. In that instant, something stirred inside him, something he had not felt in years, a memory of love, loss, and the painful reminder that even the powerful were once small and powerless. He clenched his jaw, caught in the battle between who he had become and who he once was, but deep down, Daniel knew the truth. The sound of their sobbing had awakened a part of him he thought was gone forever. Daniel stood frozen for a moment longer, his breath caught in the weight of the silence, before something inside him compelled him to move, not with the authority of a CEO, but with the hesitancy of a man rediscovering his humanity. And slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself onto one knee in front of the bench where the two girls sat. His expensive suit brushed against the cold tile floor, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, indifferent to appearances. His voice, usually sharp and commanding in meetings, came out softer, gentler, almost foreign to his own ears as he asked, "Why are you crying here all alone?" The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, like a candle flame in a storm, and the girls stiffened at first, startled that someone had finally noticed them. Emma lifted her face, streaked with tears, her small hands trembling as she wiped her eyes quickly, as if trying to appear braver than she felt, because she knew she had to protect Lily. Her lips quivered, but she forced herself to answer, her voice thin and shaky. "Our mummy she's very sick. They said she might not come back." The words hit Daniel with the force of a blow, cutting through the practiced steel of his heart. And for a moment he could not breathe, the memory of his own childhood flooding back uninvited. Lily, pressed tightly against her sister, whispered with a trembling sob, "I don't want her to leave us." Her small hands gripping Emma's sleeve as if holding on to her was the only way to stop the world from falling apart. Daniel's chest tightened painfully, the air in his lungs heavy with ghosts of his past, and in his mind, he was no longer the man in the tailored suit, but a boy again, sitting helplessly in a hospital corridor, watching the door that never opened, waiting for a mother who would never return. The image of his younger self rose vividly, lonely, broken, unnoticed by strangers who walked past without a second glance. His jaw clenched as he struggled against the ache rising in his throat, the ache of a wound he thought had long since healed, but now bled raw in front of these children's sorrow. His eyes softened, not with pity, but with recognition, an unspoken bond forming in that fragile space between them. He noticed the way Emma shielded Lily, her small body leaning protectively around her sister, and it reminded him of the nights he used to hold his younger brother, whispering lies about how everything would be okay when he himself was drowning in fear. The vulnerability before him stripped away every layer of the hardened man he had built himself to be, leaving only a human being who knew too well what it meant to feel abandoned. He inhaled slowly, eddying himself, forcing the storm of his memories into silence so he could focus on the two frightened faces looking at him. He wanted to tell them that he understood, that the fear in their eyes was the same fear he once carried, but the words caught in his throat, too fragile to speak. Instead, he allowed the silence to linger, a silence filled not with indifference but with presence, his gaze steady, his body language calm, offering the comfort he wished someone had once offered him. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, the sounds of the hospital distant, yet in that narrow stretch of corridor, a world shifted as a powerful man bent low enough to meet two broken children at eye level. Daniel reached for words again, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, as he said, "I know it hurts. I know you're scared." His heart thudded with the weight of their pain, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel fully, without barriers, without excuses, just a man kneeling in front of two fragile souls who reminded him of his own. Daniel stayed there on the cold hospital floor for a long moment, his heart heavy yet strangely lighter than it had been in years. And then, slowly, he shifted, lowering himself onto the bench beside the girls instead of standing above them, choosing to sit in their world rather than tower over it. His presence steady and warm in the bleak corridor. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deadlines or shareholders, but about the two children who needed someone to simply stay. Emma glanced at him uncertainly, her tear-stained cheeks tense with suspicion, not used to kindness from strangers, while Lily leaned closer to her sister, wide eyes studying this man who had chosen to stop when no one else had. Daniel's voice, low and steady, carried none of the steel it usually did in boardrooms. Instead, It carried patience and gentleness as he said, "You're not alone anymore." The words seemed to linger in the air, almost unbelievable to the Istas, who had felt invisible for hours. He noticed their thin clothes, the way Lily's lips trembled from the cold, and without hesitation, he stood briefly and made a call, his tone firm yet different now, not ordering an assistant but asking quietly for help. Minutes later, a nurse appeared with blankets at his request, and Daniel gently draped one over Emma and another over Lily, his hands uncharacteristically careful, as though afraid they might break. Lily clutched the blanket to her chest, her tiny fingers sinking into its softness, and for the first time that night, a faint sigh of relief slipped from her. Emma looked at him again, still cautious, but her body loosened slightly under the warmth. Daniel wasn't done. He left briefly and returned carrying 2 steaming cups of soup and small sandwiches from the cafeteria, kneeling again to hand them over. "Eat," he urged softly, and though Emma hesitated, her hunger betrayed her, and soon she was breaking pieces for Lily, who ate slowly between sniffles. Watching them, Daniel felt something awaken inside him, something tender he hadn't known he still had, the simple satisfaction of seeing a child feel cared for. He leaned back against the bench, exhaling slowly, his sharp features softening in the dim light. The corridor no longer felt like an empty, lifeless tunnel. With the girls beside him, it became a place where compassion returned to life. When Emma's cautious gaze met his again, he offered a small, genuine smile, one that came not from habit but from sincerity. "Your mom is strong," he whispered, leaning slightly closer so only they could hear. "She's fighting right now, and until she's better, I'll be right here with you." Emma's lips parted as if to protest, as if to say he didn't need to stay, but her voice failed her, and instead, a single tear slipped down her cheek, not from fear this time, but from the fragile spark of hope his words carried. Lily shifted, leaning against him without realizing it, her tiny head brushing his arm, and Daniel froze for a heartbeat, then allowed it, his chest tightening with an ache both painful and healing. He thought of his younger self, how desperately he had once needed someone to make that same promise, and silently, he vowed that these 2 little girls would not be left to face the darkness alone. For the first time in decades, Daniel Carter, the feared CEO, was not calculating or strategizing. He was simply present, offering warmth in a cold hallway, and with every passing second, the invisible walls around his heart crumbled further. The girls, who had been shadows in the eyes of everyone else, finally had someone sitting beside them, someone who had not walked away, and though their mother still fought for her life beyond the doors, for this moment they were not abandoned. They had comfort, blankets, food, and most importantly, they had hope, carried in the quiet strength of a man who had rediscovered his humanity in the darkest of nights. The hours crept forward with agonizing slowness, the sterile hospital clock ticking above them as if mocking their anxious waiting. Yet Daniel did not rise to leave, though his phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket with messages, reminders and calls that once would have demanded his immediate attention. Meetings had been scheduled, deals were waiting, but tonight none of it mattered. For the first time in years, the empire he had built was silent in his mind, overshadowed by the fragile weight of 2 small hands gripping his. He silenced his phone entirely, slipping it back into his jacket, and turned his focus to Emma and Lily, whose eyes grew heavy from exhaustion, but whose hearts refused to let sleep claim them. To ease their fear, Daniel began to speak, his deep voice weaving stories, not of contracts or business ventures, but gentle tales he half remembered from his own childhood, fragments of fairy tales his mother once told him before the world stole her away. Emma listened intently, her head leaning slightly against his shoulder as though she wanted to believe in every word, while Lily nestled closer, soothed by the rhythm of his voice. When his stories ran out, he asked them about their favorite games, their favorite colors, and their happiest memories with their mother, encouraging them to speak of love instead of fear, letting them paint the silence with warmth rather than despair. He nodded and listened with a patience few had ever seen in him, his sharp edges softened entirely by the presence of two children who trusted him more with every passing hour. And when the silence inevitably returned, heavy and suffocating, he didn't try to fill it with meaningless words. Instead, he simply held their hands, steady and firm, letting them know through touch that they were not alone, that someone was staying right beside them until the night released its grip. The hallway remained quiet, but with each story, each whispered memory, the weight pressing down on the sisters seemed to lift just enough for them to breathe. At last, when the double doors of the operating room creaked open, all three of them froze, their hearts caught in the fragile space between hope and dread. A doctor stepped out, his expression serious, and Emma clutched Daniel's arm instinctively while Lily buried her face into his side, too afraid to look. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the man approaching, his jaw tight, his breath held, bracing for the words that could either shatter or save the children beside him. The silence stretched unbearably until the doctor spoke, his voice firm yet gentle, carrying the news that pierced through the darkness. Their mother had survived the surgery. Relief flooded the corridor like light breaking through clouds, the heavy despair that had wrapped around the girls dissolving in an instant. Emma gasped, her hand flying too. Oh, her mouth as tears spilled anew, not of sorrow, but of uncontainable joy, while Lily sobbed openly, clinging to her sister and laughing through her tears. Daniel felt his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding finally breaking apart, and for a brief moment his own eyes glistened, though he quickly blinked it away. The girls cried into each other's arms, their small bodies trembling with relief, and Daniel sat silently beside them, his presence no longer just a comfort, but now a witness to their joy, to their survival, to the fragile hope that had blossomed into reality. The night was still long, the world still uncertain, but for now, the worst had passed, and in that narrow corridor, despair had been replaced by tears of gratitude, carried on the small shoulders of two little girls who had finally been given back the one person they loved most. The first rays of dawn filtered through the hospital windows, painting the sterile walls with a soft golden light that carried the promise of a new beginning. And in the quiet of the recovery room, the woman who had fought through the long night slowly opened her eyes. Blinking against the pale glow, she struggled to adjust, her body weak, but her spirit clinging stubbornly to life. And the first sight that greeted her was not only the tearful faces of her daughters, but also the tall figure of a man seated calmly beside them, his presence steady and protective. Emma and Lily rushed to her side instantly, their little voices calling, "Mommy!" with trembling joy, and she wrapped her fragile arms around them as best she could, tears streaming down her cheeks at the miracle of simply holding them again. When her gaze finally lifted, confusion filled her expression as she noticed the stranger beside them. Sharp suit, tired eyes, yet a gentle smile that didn't match the ruthless image his appearance suggested. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice low and warm, words deliberate yet sincere as he said, "Your daughters are brave, and you're very lucky." For a moment, the mother simply stared, unable to understand why a man of his stature was sitting here like a guardian in the middle of their hardship, but gratitude swelled in her chest all the same, gratitude too vast for words. Daniel didn't explain much, didn't speak of the hours he had spent with her children, or the battles he had fought within himself that night. For this moment wasn't about him. It was about the fragile family before him, reunited by hope and perseverance. Yet something deep within him had shifted irreversibly, for the man who once measured worth only in numbers and victories now saw value in something infinitely greater: compassion. From that morning onward, Daniel was no longer just a businessman, no longer the cold figure whose name was synonymous with power and fear. The memory of sitting in that dim hallway with two frightened children had carved into his soul, reminding him of what it meant to be human, to care, to love. Quietly, without fanfare, He extended his hand to their family's life, ensuring that they would never again face such darkness alone, covering medical bills, arranging for better opportunities, and offering support in ways they could never have imagined. He asked for nothing in return, no recognition, no praise, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had changed their path. For Emma and Lily, the man who once was a stranger became a figure etched forever into their hearts, not for his wealth or his power, but for the night he chose to stop when no one else did. They would remember the warmth of his voice, the blankets he brought, the steady presence that gave them strength when they were breaking, and as they grew older, they would carry with them the lesson that kindness can appear when least expected, even in the form of a man the world called ruthless. Daniel himself walked away from the hospital that day with a different heart, the weight of his empire feeling lighter, because he now understood that the true measure of a life well lived was not in contracts signed or fortunes secured, but in the moments when you choose to see another's tears and do something about them. And so the story of that silent hospital corridor became more than a passing memory. It became a turning point for 3 lives, a bond unspoken but unbreakable, sealed by compassion in the darkest of nights, a memory that would live forever in the hearts of Emma, Lily, and the man who found himself again by simply choosing to care.